You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we are talking about the 1983 Canon Films movie, Treasure of the Four Crowns, in 3D. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. On this episode, we're talking about the 1983 movie, Treasure of the Four Crowns in 3D, released by Canon Films. Pete Charbonneau, co-host extraordinaire, and I did not want to talk about this 80s classic on our own, so we brought in an expert, Austin Trunick, and Austin was kind enough to rejoin us for a conversation about Treasure of the Four Crowns and all things Canon. Austin is literally the man who wrote the books covering Canon Films. The Canon Film Guide Volume 1 covers Canon Films from 1980 to 1984. It's over 500 pages, interviews with directors, actors, and stuntmen. Volume 2 covers Canon Films from 85 to 87, 1,000 pages, so twice as big as the first volume, and he covers over 60 Canon Films. You can read up more about Austin and his work on Canon Films at canonfilmguide.com. He's Canon Film Guide on all the socials. Pete and I were ecstatic to have Austin on for this conversation, so let's get into it. You are going to hit record, right? I'm like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to do that.
Yeah, a nightmare of mine. I've been on interviews before that I've been talking to people and then realized that either the tape went, like the tape ran out. I still use tapes. Like that's how old fashioned, but the tape would run out. And when I thought I had an hour on it and stuff, things like that, I can understand.
We're recording with our minds. It's a little
Yeah, no, it's funny because over the last few months, Pete, we've been chatting 3D movies.
Yep.
And this was one that was on the short list of movies that Pete had not watched.
I'd never even heard about.
You'd never even heard about, but a movie that when we talked last time, Austin, you know, I've seen the American Ninja movies, Death Wish sequels, Superman, Quest for Peace. All right, well, let me see something that I haven't seen that obviously you would be well versed in. Let's check out Treasure of Four Crowns.
You've seen Raiders, Star Wars, Aliens, and Close Encounters. But you are about to experience a totally new dimension in entertainment. Forged from the wealth of kings, source of the magical powers of good and evil, unleashed in the hands of a madman. Now, 5 daring heroes defy the odds in a deadly quest to capture the greatest prize of them all.
Go for it!
Treasure of the Four Crowns. Ultimate modern adventure, Treasure of the Four Crowns, in Supervision 3D, coming soon from Canon Releasing, to blast you out of your seats.
It did not stick like Over the Top or Hope or any of the other Canon films, but when Pete and I were thinking about 3D movies, waxing nostalgic about Jaws 3D, Amityville 3D, all those 3D horror movies from the early to, late 80s, Treasure of the Four Crowns was not in our conversation. and now, luckily, we get to talk to you about Treasure of the Four Crowns. So perfect timing.
Excellent. How many of these movies that you've covered in your 3D, your journey to the third dimension, have been from 1983? I'm curious.
So we did Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin.
Which begs to be, you have to say the whole thing. That's a rule we came up with.
Say this every episode. You're contractually obliged to say the entire title. And then we did Space Hunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. You did not have to say the whole title on that one.
Absolutely. Yes.
That's what we've gotten to. I think at this point, I need to be a completist, and we're probably going to run through that whole little stretch of early to mid 80s 3D movies to have at least some discussion about. We'll get to Jaws and Amityville, which are like the more popular ones. We did mention the precursor to what we're going to talk about tonight, The Treasure of the Four Crowns, Coming at Ya. Bernie had dug that up in his research and was like, oh, it was like really the one that kicked off this, 80s revival 3D craze, and it was a Western. And we were both just kind of like, wow, what?
Yeah, an 80s Western, let alone an 80s 3D Western. Those are just, it fills a very, very small niche.
Yes. you could say they're few and far between, but it could be in a one in a category of one. We were going through, and Austin, this will be interesting to see if you have this memory, because when we talked last time, we're all give or take around the same age. And in 82, I believe, maybe 83, Revenge of the Creature from the Black Lagoon came out. And nationally, there was a campaign to kind of promote the fact that it was going to be in 3D. In my neck of the woods, in the Chicagoland area, Sven Gulli, who's a horror host, was really promoting it, letting folks know to go to their local 7-Eleven and grab their pair of 3D glasses so that they can watch the movie in prime time in 3D. Pete and I both remember being disappointed by the movie, but was that something in your neck of the woods, Austin? Is that a memory at all, that 3D movie?
Well, see, I don't have that memory because I was really kind of out in the boonies in Ohio, okay. So I didn't go to see many movies when I was a kid. It was all the video store. That was where everything came from. So I don't think I actually saw a 3D movie until that more recent wave, and 15 years ago or however long it was.
Piranha 3D and all of those in the early aughts.
Yes, I did not see any 3D movies for a long, until really late in my life. And I remember thinking that all 3D movies were going to be like the Jaws from Back to the Future 2. When he sees the giant thing come out, like I assumed they were like that. So once I finally saw one, it didn't quite live up to my expectations.
You two were also disappointed, Austin.
Yes, just much later.
It was later disappointment, but it was still.
Have you seen some of those 3D classics like Space Hunter or Metastorm, The Destruction of Jared Sin, Austin?
When I was working on the chapter of Treasure of the Four Crowns for the first book, I wanted to actually see what some of these other ones were like. And of course, a lot of them were on DVD or VHS or Netflix or something at the time. So I didn't get to see them in their natural 3D. Sure. Unfortunately. And when you're seeing these movies flat, it's kind of the stuff being thrown at the screen is not quite as doesn't excite, doesn't get the heart racing as it probably should in 3D. I did finally get to see Treasure of the Four Crowns in 3D, though, with Kino's Blu-ray, which was exciting. After seeing the movie I was watching it off of VHS when I wrote about it, because that was the only place to see it at the time. And yeah, the nice 3D Blu-ray was beautiful.
What was that experience like? What how was that transition? What did it look?
Oh, it was much more entertaining. At least the stuff that there are parts in Four Crowns that are very much meant to be. I think especially the beginning is one of those scenes where it's ripping off Indiana Jones, the beginning of Raiders. Obviously, things are flying at the screen, animals, rocks. It's meant to be enjoyed that way. There's place where magical things are going on. There's the finale, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, where there's flames and lasers shooting everywhere, and that stuff was still very cheesy, very silly, but. It was enjoyable in 3D. I could see where it's like, okay, if I went to see this, I wouldn't have felt entirely ripped off. There's enough 3D in here that it filled up that certain quota for me.
Sure. Well, it was interesting because when Bernie and I were talking about those sci-fi duo, we learned that I think in both their cases, they were not originally meant to be in 3D, and they were kind of shoehorned in later. Like the studios kind of like trying to jump on the craze, so they gave a couple of extra $1 million and be like, we need some 3D shots. So I think it's almost like it's pretty obvious that there were a couple of scenes where just like, okay, let's just do something because we need to have this 3D, so there's something sticking out towards the screen. Whereas Treasure of the Four Crowns, I think anything not nailed down is literally like dangled at the camera, thrown at the camera. Mm-hmm. It is pretty wild to see. Like they spared no. I don't know if they spared any expense, but they certainly spared no opportunity.
Maybe a little bit, Pete. A little expense.
Yeah. There was some expense spared, yeah, probably. But they definitely did not spare an opportunity to chuck something at the screen to have it.
Yeah, they spent a lot of money paying guys to lay off, get like just outside of the camera frame and throw things at the cameraman.
Yes. All right. So let me give folks a little bit of context if they're not aware that they clicked on a podcast titled Treasure of the Four Crowns from Canon Films, and they're not aware what we're talking about. It's the 1983 Spanish-American film Treasure of the Four Crowns, which, like Pete and Austin have mentioned, it's kind of a Raiders of the Lost Ark rip-off wannabe. And a bit of context for folks who may not be aware of movies in 1983, because I always like to have an idea when these movies came out, what they were competing with at the box office. And at times, and Austin, you mentioned this because if you didn't have movie theaters around where you were growing up, and my family was not a family that went to movie theaters, a lot of these movies I discovered at my mom and pop VHS store much later after they had been released. At a time in 1983, if you were going to the box office, Big Chill, Return of the Jedi, Octopussy, Twilight Zone the movie, Krull, Deathstalker, Christine, Cujo, Dead Zone. Stephen King had a good year in the movie theater. And movie we discussed, Space Hunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. And then amongst all that, you have Canon Films releasing Treasure of the Four Crowns. And obviously, Austin, you're kind enough to join us in this conversation because Canon was known for being, I don't know, right, by comparison, Fox, Paramount, Columbia, they released 3-4 movies in a year. Canon, triple that output, fair to say?
Easily. I think their best production year was 36 films that they had produced. And
dear Lord.
Yeah.
So
there was, I mean, famously 1986 was when they announced their slate. It was 60 films, which if you do the math, that's more than one Canon movie in theaters every weekend. On average, there's not enough weekends to debut them all, and they didn't hit that. Obviously, they fell on down times, but yeah, 36 is still pretty darn good.
This was released, at least for Canon Films, kind of in the early Globe and Globus era, right?
Yes, this was very early for them. They bought the company in 1979 and started producing movies in 1980. During those early years, it was a kind of a slow trickle that compared to what they would put out later on in the mid 1980s, how many movies, they were sort of cautiously taking their time and building up the number of the movies they produced. And this came relatively early. 83 was still by their standards, a pretty slim year for releases, even though there were a lot of films they put out then.
Yeah. I was looking at their release schedule and some movies that I'm familiar with from their movie poster and from obviously conversations with you where, again, the best conversations when we have folks on that are passionate about this is they just fill up our queues with things we want to watch. The 1980 film Schizoid that I have not seen, but I feel like that movie poster is like, it was everywhere. Like, and as a designer, it's really well designed. And then of course, Klaus Kinski as a psychotic serial killer. Come on, it speaks for itself. Then 81, Enter the Ninja, a movie that Pete, was that one of your, I know you mentioned Missing in Action was maybe your first R-rated Get 'em Chuck experience with Canon Films in the theater, but I believe I remember Enter the Dragon was up there for you, right?
Enter the Ninja, Revenge of the Ninja.
Enter the Ninja, sorry.
Yeah, those were like early video store staples for me, my brother, my cousin, my friends. Like we couldn't get enough of that stuff. So, even at that early age, you'd see the Canon logo come together like that synergy, to use that horrible corporate word, but like you saw that on screen. We already knew the quality of Canon and we knew to expect a good time if we saw the Canon logo on screen.
And you would have seen that in 82 because 82 they got the rights to Death Wish 2, Last American Virgin, a movie that I remember you mentioned, Pete, that and Porky's, don't watch them, but you end up going into a wood paneled basement somewhere and you try to sneak a peek. 7 Magnificent Gladiators, all that's before Treasure of the Four Crowns, right, Austin?
Yeah. Canon was a company too that sometimes movies they would film them or announce them and years would go by before we actually saw the results. So, and then sometimes these movies were released in some countries, but not others. So I have a hard time with settling on a release year sometimes when talking about a movie because it might have come out on video here at this time, but then in theaters 2 years before somewhere else. Yeah, 82 was Enter the Ninja did well for them in 81. 82 was Death Wish 2, was their big movie. And that's what really, it was a hit. And it gave them the sort of financial ability to start plowing forward and making many, many, many more movies, signing big deals. That's when stuff really took off. So 83 was the first year of, I guess would be really Cannon's heyday, because you do get Revenge of the Ninja, you get Hercules with Lou Ferrigno, you get also a big wave of like Sylvia Kristel movies and things like that. It mixed in between. It is an interesting time for them because it is just before they get into this pace where they're putting out film after film after film after film. Like this is a time, I think, when at least Golden Globus, when they were at the helm, were paying a little more attention to each individual product they were putting out.
And when you say they, in this case, is it probably less Menachem and because he's probably dictating the pace, trying to get more things on screen in production versus his, I think you mentioned it last time, and I always kind of find it like, wow, it's surprising. It was his younger cousin, Yoram.
Yes. Yeah. Yoram was the business mind. He was somebody who he worked in Israel in his father's movie theaters. His dad owned movie theaters there. And all he wanted to do was, sell tickets, watch movies, be like up there putting the posters up, changing the marquee and things like that. And his dad's kind of stressing out. He says, we got to get Yoram out of here. We got to shake him up. And at this time, Menachem was big into theater, but also branching out into movies and having a hard time kind of getting in there. And Yoram's father calls up Menachem and says, hey, can you talk my son out of this? Tell him like how hard it is, how much you're struggling to get into movies. And instead, Yoram recruited him. Said, about business, you can start financing these. That created an empire.
That just sounds like everything you've mentioned, things that I've heard in the documentaries Electric Boogaloo and Go-Go Boys. That just seems exactly like Menachem's character, like in his DNA. I think there's a part in Electric Boogaloo where they're talking to, I believe, maybe one of the directors, Boaz
Davidson.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And they're talking about the production of one of the films, and Menachem's wife shows up with their newborn, I believe, and they essentially use the newborn as a prop, but his wife, who's seeing their newborn on, it seems like a not so sturdy carriage, jumps in the shot, and he just starts yelling at his wife, don't get in the shot, it's like, well, we're using your child, our newborn, as a prop. But it just seems like that was Menachem's DNA. Here's my younger cousin, seems like he's astute and is somewhat business minded. Maybe I can funnel that energy, the hustle that I have, with his intellect and his management skills to actually make more, to put the dream together.
Yeah, Menachem was the one who made the creative decisions. He was the one signing the deals, greenlighting the movies, really dictating this crazy, crazy pace and this insane output that they had. But you got to think about what a genius Yoram was to just be able to keep the business going with somebody who's that is probably not the nicest thing to say, but not really the most sensible person to be running a movie studio. Not really, no business in his mind. He's all about, he just wants to make the movies. He wanted to make the movies, and Yoram amazingly was able to keep the lights on and keep those movies going for as long as they did. You
can almost hear that conversation. Menachem, we can't make 60 films. That's impossible. Well, What would you have me do? 16? No, we'll settle on 36.
That's like one of the big things that led to their eventual breakup when Golden Globus split and the cousins were torn apart in the late 80s was because they were getting bailed out by companies that people were helping them, trying to keep Cannon from going under. And Yoram was telling them, we can't do this many films. I have to start saying no to you. And Menachem wouldn't hear it. So that's when he went off for 21st Century. He didn't want to be told no. He didn't want to be told that he couldn't make these like 26 movies that he came up with in the last week.
I always visualize Yoram kind of having like this tenuous rein on Menachem, like to be like trying to keep it like Cannon Films going, but like, he's reining him in, but at the same time, like his feet are like in the air and he's flying because like he's really holding on for dear life. And it sounds like Holding On for Dear Life ended in the late 80s where he just could not sustain that wild of a ride.
Yeah. Cannon's business model was it wasn't unique because you had Corman and people doing that before them, Sam Arkoff doing these same things before Cannon did. But the way their business model worked is the more movies Yoram had to sell, the more money they could make because they were collecting the money to make these films, pre-selling them. And so anytime they ran into trouble, anytime they ran into debt, they spent too much on a movie, they spent too much on Life Force. So how do we make up that money that we lost spending too much on Life Force. We double our output for the next year. We just make twice as many movies to make twice as much money. And eventually it kind of grew out of proportion. That's when you get a year like 1986 where they plan 60 movies, they go out to pre-sell them, and they can't deliver on all of those because they don't have the money to do it all.
And I was going to ask, in this case, Austin, getting into like Treasure of the Four Crowns, there's the runaway train that is Menachem Golan. But because this is so early, and the fact that it's so obviously riding on the coattails on the popularity of Raiders, the other part to me where I'm like, yes, the two of them very much needed each other, because that's the only way these productions would have come to life, by having Yoram actually get them to completion. You can sell them in as many markets as you want, get as much money as you can together to make this film. But in the end, someone had to kind of shepherd that production, make the infrastructure. It seems like that was Yoram, but there's at least maybe some awareness here to realize Raiders is popular, Star Wars is popular, Aliens is popular, Close Encounters is popular, so let's make a movie that's more popular than all of those, as the movie says in the beginning, and let's make Treasure of the Four Crowns. I think there's a lot of awareness here to, like you mentioned, we were successful with Death Wish 2. Let's do this to continue to ride that popularity in the box office. Is that fair to say for Treasure?
For Treasure, yes. They wanted to get in on the 3D craze. Where I think they felt they probably had an advantage is the team that had made Coming At You, which had sort of kicked this off, came to them with this. I basically wanted to make another movie. Those guys were independent producers. They had really hustled to get Coming At You made, and so when Canon was willing to back them and feed them money to make it, I think it was a very good coming together of two different groups, and it was going to lead to many other things. I mean, Gene Quintano, who was a co-producer, he acted in this one and he also wrote it. He did a lot of stuff for Canon, and they had planned a lot more. There were other 3D movies that Canon was supposed to do after Treasure of the Four Crowns that did not come to be because, well, 3D died out pretty quick. And Treasure of the Four Crowns was not the success that Coming At You was.
Do you know how their roads crossed, Austin? Because it was directed by Fernandino Baldi, who had done Django, Prepare a Coffin, which was a really good movie with Terrence Hill. And then you have Tony Anthony, who stars as JT Stryker. I mean, if that was not the name of a Mask or G.I. Joe character, that did not I don't know why. That's such a great name.
Let's pause for a second just to bathe in the light that is the name Tony Anthony. I'm like, if anything, I was coming up with a list of names where you just kind of like take a first name and then like shorten it. And so, I mean, like Tom Thomas, Stu Stewart, Jennifer, Dan. I mean, like, this is just that. I mean, I know that's not, I think that's a stage name, but when I saw that name pop up on screen in the credits, I knew I was in for just a glorious experience.
But did you know, Pete, his actual last name is Antonio? So it's actually Tony Anthony Antonio.
I did not know that, which makes
I just made it up. That's complete bullshit. Oh. But that he actually inspired the band Tony. Just letting you know.
Dougie Doug and Susie Sue. There's so many out there that are actually real names. But I could probably have like hours of entertainment just coming up with some fun names. Like
variations on this.
It's never ending. I think that we can do an entire cast of just names like that and go wild.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
So how did these guys cross paths with Golan and Globus, Austin? I'm very interested. It seems like maybe they were kindred spirits.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where. I imagine it was probably the Cannes Film Festival, where Golan and Globus were very famous, even in the Canon years too. That was their playground. They would go there and buy and sell movies. That's where they did most of their business. They described the festival as their Christmas. And it wasn't them getting gifts. It was them bringing gifts to the world. It was
You mean they weren't giving out the sweatsuits to everyone?
No. Forgot about the sweatsuits.
Yeah, I just actually procured my first actual Canon sweatsuit from.
Are you serious?
Yeah. So once I find matching pants, I will do a full photo shoot. And
If that's not your new author picture for volume 3, then I don't know what it could be, Austin. That's amazing. First, congratulations, because
Thank you.
I remember last time we were talking about Canon Films, and we talked about your passion for Canon. We kind of did a brief survey of Canon Films, legacy of the movies, our memories of them, and you'd mentioned how you have a pretty good collection of memorabilia, postcards, posters, and now that you can add do you know if it's a worn sweat jacket?
It is worn. I don't know whose it was. Unfortunately, later years and on a lot of the movies, I have quite a few of the film crew jackets from different productions, and they'll have somebody's name stitched on them. So you can piece it together. I've got a 52 pickup jacket that was worn. I was able to find out that it was the driver on the movie, the guy who drove John Frankenheimer around. I have one of the Spider-Man jackets from the unmade Spider-Man movie. Mm-hmm. So it's fun being able to tell who wore it, how it got to me. This one I don't. It's the 1984 Cannes Film Festival jacket. It has the big Adidas logo on the back and the Canon logo on the front. I was so excited to finally track it down. Yeah, I have some odds and ends, actually. Again, this is being a podcast, terrible to be playing show and tell. But
this is one step closer to the Canon Museum that you will open up.
I promise when this goes live, though, I will put it on Twitter, and hopefully I'll tag you guys, and people listening can
Sure.
But I almost wore this, but it's one of the original pairs of 3D glasses from Treasure of the Four Crowns.
Oh, wow.
Just describing the audiobook version here. It's got a 3-headed snake in the middle, kind of a psychedelic green and white squiggle design, and then Treasure of the Four Crowns on one side and Wonder Vision 3D written on the other.
Oh yeah, Wonder Vision, that amazing technology that doesn't actually exist.
The back has coming soon from Canon.
Hercules. It's got the Hercules.
Yeah, Lou Ferrigno and Hercules.
Oh, I love that they'd never spare an opportunity to market the next project.
No. But yeah, so we were talking about Tony Anthony, Gene Quintano finding each other with Canon. The Cannes Film Festival, before Canon, Golden Globus were doing that all the time, like every year. They'd been, I think, the 1987 Canon catalog from the festival said across the front, our 20th year at the festival, which is doing the math that puts them there since the late 60s. They've been doing it. And the model that they brought with them to Canon, they had been doing before Canon with producing movies in Israel and selling them on the world market. And in the same way, Tony Anthony, or Tony Petito, I think is his real name, he had been in kind of like this third tier, like C-level series of spaghetti westerns. He was kind of like this, not on the same level as your Franco Nero or Eastwood, of course, but basically, I would say the way where Michael Dudikoff was to the 80s action films, he might have been to the spaghetti westerns at their height. And Fernando Baldi had done a lot in Italian movies, and I imagine they just crossed paths. It was probably at the festival, because that's where they would have been there hustling to sell, coming at you. Canon's there looking to spend money. Canon Menachem Golan would take meetings. That's what he'd do. He'd go and he'd have meeting after meeting after meeting with people. And the joke was, if you could get a meeting with Menachem, you can get your film greenlit. It was just a matter of finding time when he wasn't busy or on top of running Canon, directing several movies a year, and just working at a crazy pace. Yeah, they would have taken a meeting with him. Canon, usually a deal was signed within 10 to 15 minutes if they were interested in working with you. Judging by even before Treasure of the Four Crowns came out, they were already working on follow-ups and other 3D projects that they were going to do with sort of the same group shooting in Italy. Canon Italia was their Italian division. I imagine it was probably love at first sight.
It makes sense. They release, again, in the most esoteric of film categories, 3D spaghetti western in Coming at You. They meet kindred spirits in Golan and Globus who want to get a movie out there, riding the coattails of Raiders, and is also in 3D. Everything makes sense on why they would do business together, because I'm sure in the Canon Films perspective, it's good business. This should get good box office for them. And if they're working with people who are somewhat minded in the hustle and production, it should work.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like a match made in a cult castle that's hiding ancient crowns, of which there are reportedly 4.
Yes, there you go. So, Pete, you had not heard of this movie, let alone watched it until recently for this episode. I'd watched this movie when we first talked to Austin for the last episode. And Austin, obviously, you wrote the books, now plural, on Canon Films. But had you watched this movie before becoming a Canon evangelist, before writing the books?
Yes.
Okay.
This was one that I had seen on the MGM, the book box VHS tape in a flat version, obviously on, my 19-inch TV that my parents had. And yeah, I mean, because I was an Indiana Jones fan. And so anything that looked remotely like Indiana Jones on the cover, I was going to want to rent. So this would have been one that I'd seen back then. And of course, the VHS makes no mention of 3D, that it's supposed to be a 3D film. That's how people mostly saw it on TV and on VHS. And the special effects, when they're not popping out of the screen at you, they tend to be less impressive. So I do remember renting this, and it was definitely one of my. I was not impressed as a kid. I did not have a high impression. So when I came back to write about it, I sort of had this. I don't want to say negative, but it was definitely like a letdown, childhood feelings of being let down by a movie, because it was not the Indiana Jones sequel looking thing that it promised from the cover.
Sure. It's a tough comparison to make, especially for Raiders. If you have a kind of like a love for Raiders, for Indiana Jones, for the tone, for those pulp era movies seen through the eyes of Spielberg, and then you see something like this, you would almost have to have the passion you have for Canons to kind of look at it from a archival forensic standpoint, to start, looking at the production, how it was made, because the film very much leans into, like both of you guys have talked about, the gimmicky aspect of 3D, where it was made 3D in mind, things being thrown out at the screen. I have a laundry list of things. The one that I will mention, of course, is the otter with a knife in its mouth that opens up, because that is amazing. But anything from turkey vultures, spears, darts, flaming boulders that are more like beach ball size, not like Jones boulder size.
Yeah.
But this was made almost less as a movie and almost more as a 3D gimmick.
As a spectacle, yes.
Yes.
On that front, I think it plays much better. Again, this is a movie that finally getting to see it in some form of 3D with the Kino Lorber Blu-ray that was put out a year or two ago. I definitely had a higher opinion of it. All of that stuff was fun, because when you're watching the movie flat, you can tell, like, okay, all the stuff is supposed to be popping out at me. But then when it's actually popping out at you and there's more of it than you can ever really wrap your brain around, it's an assault. It's a 3D assault.
All right. Well, Pete, as a first-time victim of a 3D assault, courtesy of Treasure of the Four Crowns, what'd you think?
I think I tweeted earlier today, like, what the hell did I just watch? It's so wild, because I had to watch it in 2 parts. I started watching it the other night, and I'm like, I'm going to watch the opening scene just to get a little feel for it, and then I'll watch the bulk of it after that. But the opening scene literally is like 20 minutes long. Again, like, this is very much a Raiders knockoff. So it's very much like the opening to Raiders, where you've got your soldier of fortune type, JT Stryker is in search of some treasure, but literally zero dialogue for the first 20 plus minutes. There's no dialogue whatsoever, which I thought was wild. You've got an opening crawl, which is, lifted from Star Wars, where there's not a single punctuation mark. It's just a run-on sentence. And so good luck trying to figure out what exposition they're giving you. And then I literally laughed out loud, because it starts out, you think like you're in some kind of desert area. It's all very, rocky and not a lot of green. And you get the legs of this character, and it pans up to introduce yourself to JT Stryker. But as it's panning up, I'm thinking, all right, well, this guy's going to be dressed for his location. And then he's got like the khaki pants, and all of a sudden it's like red members only jacket. It's like, well, this is wild. I'm like, okay, so let's have some fun with this. And then, then you're literally, I think people could probably, accuse this film of assault for the assault of 3D that's thrown at you, like anything from just dangling ropes. There's, multiple shots of like the same spear coming out, and there you're up and running. I will say this is not the best made film by any stretch, But anyone that is a fan of Raiders, Austin, like you were, like I think we all are, the elements are there of that standard adventure film. It's like you've got your opening set piece. You've got like the exposition of what the larger story is going to be. You've got him going to recruit the team, who maybe, like, with the exception of what's the name of the woman?
Liz, the trapeze artist.
Liz, the trapeze artist, I think is the only one that seems remotely qualified for the mission ahead of them.
Yeah, you get a strong man with a bad heart and an alcoholic, like
mountain climber.
Climber, yeah.
Yep. And let's not forget the bureaucrat, Edmund the wimpy bureaucrat. Sorry, Pete. Continue.
But I mean, like there are elements there for what would make a good adventure movie. And I was just kind of laughing at the fact, you meet Socrates, who's this strong man wearing like Blue Man Group / Hulk Smash face paint makeup, but he's wearing like a green suit. And it telegraphs his heart issue right off the bat. So I'm like, well, this guy's a dead man. I'm just waiting for that massive heart attack to come on. But my overall opinions was this is not a good movie, but I was thoroughly entertained. I think it was a little disjointed because you kind of go from like piece to piece to piece. And I don't know if they were just padding it, but there's a lot that happens. There's a length of time that happens in each scene, but not a lot going on. Like I don't know how long it took, like 15 minutes for them to traverse the room at the end.
Oh yeah, it's
just like there's scenes
so many rafters,
kind of interminable that with some editing and maybe a tighter script and story could have been punched up a bit, but
and 50 minutes long, Pete.
Yeah, but again, like these are the things that fascinate me about films like this, like how they get made, how they come into the world. Because I'm like, okay, I can see what they're trying to do here, but it's like the pacing's all off. And by no means am I a filmmaker, so far be it for me to judge. But I'm relying on my 40 plus years of seeing movies both incredible and not so incredible.
That's the most grueling scene, especially if you're watching it on a VHS tape or a stream or something like that. Because they spend, it feels like almost a quarter of the runtime of the movie getting from one side of this throne room or treasure room or whatever it is to the other, just slowly climbing across the ceiling. And as exciting as going to your like YMCA and watching somebody on a rock wall or something.
There's like super close-ups of like carabiners being locked into place for like every single character. It's like, okay, we get it. They're all safe. They practiced good safety on this. Fantastic. Now, can we please get to the other side of the room?
Only 20 minutes later, Pete. 20 minutes later, after we get through many, many shots of rafters and carabiners. I have to say, like, you guys got it right. There are so many set pieces here where I think if we probably go back and watch this, and I have to imagine, Austin, how many times have you seen this movie now?
I gotta say maybe 6 or 7, I would guess.
Follow-up question. How many times have you seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? I just want to compare here.
Oh, gosh. Wow. Wow. A lot more. A lot more.
Okay.
A lot of those, but those are like childhood repeated viewings.
Fair enough.
I just watched Raiders with my kids for the first time, which was super fun after not seeing it in a few years.
It's always great to see a movie like that through like your kid's eyes or someone else's eyes. That makes it almost more fun.
It's fun watching a movie like that I feel like most people who love movies have seen a bunch of times. Watching anybody react to something, not knowing what's going to happen, like of all things that have been parodied ever, like listening to my daughter gasp when the rock boulder drops. That's the first image I think of when I think of Raiders of the Lost Ark. But just to be sitting with somebody who's surprised by that, even if she's 7 years old, it was pretty magical. But not every movie goes that well. I'll show my kids other movies from my childhood that I'll be like, Dad, this sucks. Like, this is boring. We haven't done Temple of Doom yet, but
okay. So are you going to save like Treasure of the Four Crowns for that one day where a complete bait and switch? You're like, here's the cover. Daddy has the poster for this. And they're like, hey, Dad, you've shown us great parenting skills and have shown us only the best of movies. Of course, we'll trust your judgment here. Treasure of the Four Crowns. That sounds great. And then at some point, you're like, And this is what happens when you don't do your chores, kids.
Exactly. When a Saturday comes and they've been bad all day, that'll be my punishment that I break out in this movie night.
Shape up. I'm going to show you King Solomon's Mines next.
By the writer of Treasure of the Four Crowns.
Oh man! Oh really?
Yeah, Gene Quintano wrote both of the Quatermain movies for canon after this.
Man, Edward the wimpy bureaucrat was obviously was getting some work, so good for him. Again, the set pieces for this, the end, right? The castle, the scene that I was paying attention to a little bit more this time around, my second viewing of it, was the setup for, like you mentioned, Pete, the team, when they bring everyone together and they have this model that is pretty impressive. I mean, it's motorized. There's lights involved there. The scale of it just immediately, I had Christopher Lloyd in my head where he's like, sorry, I didn't have enough time to build a scale model. And, McFly is completely impressed. These guys, the bureaucrat, the museum, I forget whoever that is that's kind of employed them to go on this treasure hunting adventure. They took the time to put together this model of the castle for our villainous cult leader. Pretty impressive.
They put together a hell of a diorama, so much that they even got like the floor sensitive, like that. I was laughed out loud when they kept dropping the feather that set off floor alarms, and everyone is intently, because this is like the plan, and everyone, it's like, and it's cut to shots of everyone looking around like, where's that noise coming? Like, it was like completely dumbfounded as to why the siren is going off. But I have a question, and I don't want to get too deep into the plot, but they finally get to the, like, this. I don't know how long it took for them to assemble the team and go, but it seemed to be a pretty tight time crunch here. But clearly, in prep, someone built this amazing diorama of the cult castle. So there's a lot of work put into that. They get to the actual castle, and there's literally zero time that they did acclimating, because they do a couple of jogs across, the property, and everyone is like, oh man, I'm out of breath. It's like, did you not train for this? They're just going to go in cold and just, we're just going to wing it and hope for the best.
Yeah, they put all that energy into that model, I think.
Exactly.
I was thinking this whole time, is at least from a production standpoint, that you spend that much time and energy and probably money in making this model. How do you not use that model for pickup shots or for angles that maybe are supposed to double for the actual castle? But no, all we get is, like Pete mentioned, a few shots of entering into the castle, which are pretty quick. A few shots of Socrates, heaving because, of course, bad heart. And we know that's all going to lead to something kind of sad when they get inside. And then we just get rafter after rafter after rafter, even though we've been told that this villain, and mind you, this villain is an ex-con from Brooklyn that basically, as we've known, has created a network of Hare Krishnas that are like putting together money towards funding his villainy. He's able to raise an army. He has a castle fortress. They have weapons. He has ancient priceless artifacts. He has motion sensors, sonic locks, lasers, guard dogs, electrified gates, pressure sensitive floors, basic security, guys with masks, guards that remind me of that. Is it Eye of the Beholder from the Twilight Zone episodes? It's like kind of like a wrinkled dog-like mask underneath these balaclavas. So this guy is investing in technology and theatrics. I'm very impressed. This is very cool, but none of that is on screen because all we see is rafters.
Well, we'll return to the rafters in a moment, or not. There's a lot of raftering, but
there's a whole extra podcast we'll do on the rafters. At least I would like to, if you guys don't mind.
This is our four-part series on the Treasure of the Four Crowns rafters. But it's interesting that you mentioned the masks, because what they reminded me of was, and this might be a little bit of a pull here, but it was the cavemen humanoids from the At the Earth's Core. Peter Cushing, Caroline Munro, and Doug McClure 70s flick. It looked very much like those guys. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, please look it up and please validate.
With the cool pterodactyl creatures, and they have the whole scene, and they're flying in the cavern. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, back to the Raptors.
Sorry. Just and for the record, there are pterodactyls in this movie too. In that intro you mentioned, Pete, the 20-some minute intro without dialogue, where we get little Muppet pterodactyls lunged at the screen and at JT Stryker, but he survives, and the wild turkeys too that are thrown at him.
They're apparently epileptic because that thing was shaking like crazy towards its frame.
I'm just hoping that, Austin, all of those effects really paid off for you when you were watching that Kino Lorber 3D, genuinely 3D version where you got to see all the gimmicks in their full spectacle glory.
You might need to define paid off.
I guess this is where the movie
improved the experience.
There you go. That's right. Because the movie is certainly not a dense movie. It's not a plot heavy movie. It moves fairly quickly. The music, when you were talking about seeing those credits, Pete, in the beginning, oh my God, Ennio Morricone, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, talk about like spaghetti westerns, all the Sergio Leone movies, Cinema Paradiso, and then this, pretty stunning.
And this is after The Thing too that he collaborated.
Oh, is it really?
Because the Thing came out in '82, so
yeah,
that was wild. I saw this name come up for the music. I was like, whoa. Was not expecting that.
He ended up doing a few Cannon movies too. He ended up The Sahara, the Brooke Shields romantic adventure movie, and a movie called Nana, the True Key of Pleasure, an erotic film adaptation, literary adaptation. Another one with Ennio Morricone score, which is amazing that the guy was that prolific, because these are all great scores. They're better than the movies in a lot of those cases.
So it seems like he had a very good relationship with Golan and Globus in that they would. It reminds me a bit of Larry Cohen using Bernard Herrmann to do It's Alive, and he does the score for that. And I believe from what I was reading, Bernard Herrmann was older and he just wasn't being approached by studios, by filmmakers to do the score, but he's still Bernard Herrmann. And, having worked with Hitchcock and so many iconic scores, you have Larry Cohen, who maybe has the wherewithal or the moxie to say, well, do you want to score my movie about a killer mutant baby? And Bernard Herrmann's like, sure, why not? Let's do that. And Ennio Morricone must have had at least a good relationship with Cannon to score not only this, but others.
Yeah, I would believe so. I think it was also just a different, it would have been a change of pace, because they would have had to write their Cannon scores when you get an Ennio or a Pino Donaggio doing something for them, or some of the guys of that caliber, because Cannon worked fast. I would guess Ennio didn't have more than, probably 2 weeks to score this movie or any of these movies when he'd be working on, some of these guys. I'm sure they torture themselves over their big studio pictures that they are scoring for like months on end, and if they need a quick paycheck, they can count on Cannon. I mean, the work they get from them is still spectacular, even in this truncated amount of time that Cannon was allowing them.
And you have the weekend. Think of something epic, majestic, and amazing. Also, I need it by Monday at 9 a.m. Thank you. and he obliged. It was a great score. If anything, it's one of those scores that I'm surprised hasn't been lifted by Tarantino for one of his movies. It feels like something that he would license, that he would use, I think, in the ways he used, I think, some of Ennio Morricone stuff in The Hateful Eight.
It was reminding me, Bernie, of like when we talked about with Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin, with Charlie Band's brother doing the music for that really like made that movie like probably 10 times better than it had any right to be. Again, like you bring in someone like Morricone for this, and probably not what anyone would consider one of his more memorable scores. But again, given, like you said, Austin, like if he had like the weekend or a week or two to pull this together, it's still elevating the film. So I think that's another just fascinating aspect of it, to pull in someone that's that talented of an artist to kind of really elevate, like a very gimmicky of its time piece on screen.
Jumping off topic slightly, but Jerry Goldsmith, who did the score for King Solomon's Mines, very good score for that movie, but it happened so late. I don't know how long he had to do it, but it happened so late that people were seeing preview cuts of the film at film festivals to like actually buy it and take it home to their country and show in their theaters. The movie was cut to the Raiders of the Lost Ark John Williams soundtrack. Such a Cannon move, because that's every critic who saw it at the film festivals, pointed out, and they laughed about that. Like, oh, Cannon is making this Indiana Jones ripoff, and they're brave enough to put the Indiana Jones score in there as like a temporary hold music until Jerry Goldsmith finishes his. That's how fast Canon worked. So between them having a complete enough cut to show people at festivals who were going to buy the movie and put it out that summer, and actually delivering it, Jerry Goldsmith scored it, which is, I'm sure, much quicker than Jerry Goldsmith was doing work for anyone else.
All right, that's the end of part 1 of our discussion with Austin about Canon Films' The Treasure of the Four Crowns in 3D in WonderVision. Make sure to come back for part 2 of our conversation, where we discuss the rise and fall of the 80s 3D trend, unmade Canon films that would have been in 3D, how Canon was able to take advantage of the burgeoning home video rental market to get their movies out there, to fill mom and pop VHS shelves, to make their name known, to make their bones in an industry that looked at them as B-movie, low-budget fare compared to the big Hollywood productions. And of course, we finished talking about Treasure of the Four Crowns, its crazy ending, and more.